20 years without a woman, then the Apache woman said, "You know what to do, cowboy." Tom Walker had spent the last 20 years of his life in the wide, empty plains of New Mexico, a land where the sky stretched endlessly and the horizon seemed to go on forever. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers and dust from distant trails. It was a land of freedom, but it was also a land of solitude, and for Tom it had become both a home and a cage. He had not always lived alone. Once, long before the years had piled on his shoulders and etched lines into his face, Tom had known the warmth of companionship. He had loved and lost. He had hoped and been disappointed. And slowly, over time, he had chosen a life of solitude over heartbreak. For 2 decades he had lived with only the company of his horses, the occasional wandering traveler, and the endless sky above him. Some nights, when the stars burned brightly and the silence of the desert felt almost heavy, he would think back to those days and wonder if he had made the right choice. Life as a cowboy was not easy. Every day brought hard work and challenges that demanded strength, patience, and resilience. Tom would rise with the sun, its first rays spilling gold over the rolling plains. He would saddle his horse, ride along the fences, check on the cattle, and repair anything the wind, rain, or time had damaged. His hands were calloused and strong, his skin tanned from years under the unrelenting sun. Yet no matter how physically demanding his work, it was the silence around him that weighed heaviest. He had a small cabin near the edge of a creek, built with weathered wood and patched carefully over the years. Inside, it was simple but cozy, filled with the few possessions he had accumulated: a worn rocking chair, a handmade table, a few blankets, and shelves stacked with books that he occasionally read to pass the quiet hours. The cabin was functional, yes, but it lacked the warmth of laughter, the aroma of cooking for two, or the comfort of someone waiting at the end of the day. 20 years of waking up alone and sleeping alone had made him an expert in self-reliance, but it had also left him feeling hollow in ways he could not easily explain. The townsfolk in the nearest settlement knew of Tom, though few had ever spent much time with him. They called him a good man, dependable and honest, though perhaps a little strange for his love of isolation. Children whispered about the lone cowboy when they passed by his land, imagining him as a mysterious figure from the stories their grandparents told. Merchants and neighbors would occasionally come to trade supplies or ask for help, but these visits were brief, polite, and never personal. Tom liked it that way. Too much closeness, he thought, could only bring disappointment. But despite the years of solitude, Tom was not entirely without feeling. There were mornings when the sun rose over the plains and a quiet ache would settle in his chest, reminding him of the family he never had, of friends who had moved on, and of the life he had chosen to leave behind. The nights were the worst, when the wind whispered through the trees and the silence pressed against his ears. Sometimes he would talk to his horse, Old Blue, sharing thoughts he could not share with anyone else. "You understand me, don't you, Blue?" he would say, his voice low and steady. The horse would nuzzle his shoulder, and for a moment the world felt less empty. Tom's solitude was not entirely lonely, though. He had developed a rhythm with the land and the animals, a kind of harmony that came from understanding their needs and caring for them consistently. He knew which cows were pregnant, which fences needed mending, and which trails were safest to take during a storm. In many ways, the land had become his companion, its beauty and danger a constant presence in his life. He had learned to read the clouds for rain, to listen to the wind for signs of storms, and to track the small animals that crossed his path each day. The world, though quiet, was alive, and Tom felt a connection to it that few people ever experienced. Even so, He could not deny that part of him ached for human connection. He had long ago accepted that the world of relationships might no longer be his, but sometimes, deep inside, a quiet longing would stir. It was not a loud cry or a desperate need. Rather, it was a gentle whisper, like the soft rustling of leaves in the evening. He would catch himself imagining conversations, laughter, or even the simple act of sitting with someone in silence without feeling the hours stretch painfully long. It was a feeling he had learned to carry quietly, tucked away behind his steady work and his calm exterior. His life, though simple, was not without small joys. Sunsets over the plains were breathtaking, painting the sky with colors that seemed almost unreal. Deep purples, fiery oranges, and soft pinks blending together in ways that made him stop whatever he was doing just to watch. The mornings brought the sound of birdsong and the fresh scent of dew on the grass. On rare occasions, a traveler would pass by, sharing stories of faraway places, and Tom would listen, feeling the thrill of a world beyond his own. These moments reminded him that life could still surprise him, even after 20 years of predictability. Tom had also developed a habit of journaling. Each evening, by the dim light of a lantern, he would write about his day, his thoughts, and the small observations of the land. It was a ritual that grounded him, giving shape to the endless days and nights. Sometimes when he wrote about the past, he would feel a pang of regret or nostalgia, but more often it was a way to preserve the life he had built for himself, a life of quiet dignity and simple accomplishments. Despite the comfort he found in routine, he could not escape the occasional loneliness. When storms rolled across the plains bringing thunder and heavy rain, he would watch the lightning flash and wonder who might be out there, somewhere, living a life full of the connection he had forsaken. On such nights he would sit by the fire, Blue beside him, and stare into the flames, thinking about what might have been and what could still be. There was a quiet sadness in these moments, but also a sense of peace. He had chosen his path, and he had walked it well, even if it was sometimes lonely. Yet the truth was that Tom was not entirely closed off to the possibility of change. Deep down, he still hoped that life might offer him a chance, however small, to share his world with someone else. He had learned patience through long years of solitude, and he knew that if it ever came, he would recognize it. But until that day arrived, he would continue his work, follow his routines, and find contentment in the land, the animals, and the quiet rhythm of life he had created. 20 years had shaped him into a man of strength, resilience, and self-reliance, but they had also taught him about the subtle ache of human connection. Tom Walker, the lone cowboy, lived in a world that was both beautiful and lonely, a world that tested his endurance and rewarded his perseverance. And while he had long accepted that his life would be solitary, a small, quiet hope lingered in his heart, a hope that one day the wind might carry something or someone new into his life, something that would change the plains from a place of isolation into a home filled with companionship once more. And so, with the sun rising over the endless horizon and the wind gently rustling the grasses, Tom mounted his horse, Blue, and rode across the land he had come to love. He rode with purpose, with pride, and with a heart that, despite 2 decades of solitude, still had room for the unknown. For in the quiet of the plains, beneath the vast open sky, anything could happen. And Tom Walker, the cowboy who had spent 20 years without a woman, could still find that life had a way of surprising him when he least expected it. The days passed quietly on Tom Walker's land, the sun rising and setting over the endless plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. His life had fallen into its familiar rhythm, checking the cattle, mending fences, and riding his horse Blue across the rolling hills. Yet in the back of his mind he could not shake a feeling that something, or someone, was about to enter his carefully ordered world. He had learned long ago that life rarely stayed the same for long, and though he had spent 20 years alone, he had not lost the sense that change could arrive quietly, even on the most ordinary day. It was during one of those ordinary days that he first noticed her. She appeared as a shadow in the distance, walking along a dusty trail that led to the edge of his property. At first Tom thought it was a traveler, someone passing through, perhaps seeking water or shelter, but as she drew nearer, he realized she was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her steps were confident and steady, her eyes calm and observant, and her presence carried a quiet strength that seemed to command the open land around her. The woman, Nayeli, was an Apache. Her dark hair fell in soft waves across her shoulders, and her skin had the warm glow of someone who had spent her life close to the earth. She carried no unnecessary baggage, only a small satchel slung across her back, and a quiet determination that Tom found both strange and fascinating. When their eyes met, it was as if she had seen into the heart of his world and understood him completely, without a word being spoken. Tom, who had spent 2 decades avoiding unnecessary interaction with people, felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest. His instincts told him to keep his distance, to let her pass and continue on her journey, but something about the way she moved, the quiet authority she exuded, made him pause. He watched as she approached the creek near his cabin, kneeling to drink from the clear, cool water. He noticed the careful way she observed the land, the way she seemed aware of every sound and movement around her. It was as if she belonged there, even though she had just arrived. "Hello," Tom called out, his voice rough from years of talking mostly to himself and his horse. Nayeli looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, and she smiled. Not a wide, bright smile, but one that was calm and knowing, as though she already understood him in ways words could not convey. "Hello," she replied softly, her voice carrying the melody of the wind and the quiet authority of someone who had lived close to nature all her life. For a moment they simply observed each other, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Tom felt a strange sense of relief that someone had come into his world without immediately judging him or demanding anything. Nayeli's presence was gentle but powerful, like a river that could shape the land without force, and Tom realized that he was both wary and intrigued at the same time. "Are you lost?" he asked finally, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "No," she said. "I am traveling, and I am here for a short while." Her tone was calm, almost deliberate, as if every word was chosen with care. "I have heard of this land and the man who lives alone here. I wanted to see for myself." Tom raised an eyebrow. He had expected travelers, merchants, maybe even curious neighbors from the nearest town, but he had never imagined anyone would seek him out specifically. "You have heard of me?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Yes," she said simply. "Word travels across the plains. You live with the land, with the animals, and with your thoughts. I wanted to see the man who has lived this way for so long." Tom felt a mix of curiosity and caution. He had spent years avoiding human company because he feared disappointment, but this woman, this stranger, seemed different. She did not judge, she did not rush, and she did not expect anything from him. And yet her presence made his heart beat in a way it had not in years. Over the next few days, Nayeli remained on the edge of his property, always respectful of his space, never imposing. She helped with small tasks without asking, such as gathering firewood or mending small sections of fence. She was skilled with her hands, precise and careful, Yet she did not flaunt her abilities. Tom watched her work and found himself appreciating the quiet efficiency and grace she brought to even the simplest tasks. He noticed other small details too, the way she spoke softly to the animals, who seemed to respond to her presence with a calmness they did not show to him, the way she observed the land, noting changes in the weather or the tracks of distant animals, the way she listened, really listened, when he spoke. There was no rush, no demand for answers, no need to impress. It was a patience he had long forgotten existed in human beings. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and painted the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Nayeli approached Tom while he repaired a section of fence. "You work hard," she said quietly, observing him with a careful gaze. "You have done so for many years, and yet you do it with a kind of quiet strength. I can see that you have learned much from this land." Tom paused, leaning on his hammer, unsure how to respond. It was rare for someone to see his efforts without judgment, and her words struck a chord deep within him. "I have no choice," he said, finally shrugging. "This is life. This is how I survive." "You survive," she corrected gently, "but you also live. You live because you care for this land, for the animals, and for yourself. That is something not everyone can do." Her words lingered in the air long after she had walked away, stirring feelings Tom had not felt in years. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a life that included her presence, not just as a visitor, but as someone who could share in the quiet, steady rhythm of his days. He pushed the thought aside quickly, afraid of letting hope take root too soon. Yet he could not deny that the idea had a strange and compelling appeal. Days turned into a week, and Tom began to notice subtle changes in his routines. He found himself anticipating Nayeli's presence, wondering where she would be and what she would be doing. He realized that her quiet companionship, even without words, brought a sense of warmth and ease that he had long forgotten. The evenings, once spent in solitude with only Blue for company, were now shared with conversations that ranged from the land and weather to stories of her travels and experiences. Despite his growing comfort, Tom remained cautious. He had spent 20 years protecting himself from disappointment, and he knew that opening his life to someone, even gently, carried risks. He watched Nayeli with a careful eye, noting her kindness, her patience, and her quiet strength, but he did not let himself become too attached too quickly. He reminded himself that she was a visitor, a stranger, and that life could change at any moment. Yet there were moments when his guard slipped. He found himself laughing at her jokes, enjoying her company during meals, and even looking forward to sharing the quiet moments of the evening as the sun set over the plains. He noticed the way Blue seemed to respond to her presence, nudging her hand for attention, and he realized that the animals, too, had accepted her as part of the rhythm of his life. It was during one of these evenings, as they sat by the fire and watched the stars emerge one by one, that Nayeli spoke with a hint of challenge in her voice. "You have spent many years alone," she said softly, "and yet I can see that your heart has room, even if you have forgotten it." Tom looked at her, startled by the insight. "I have forgotten nothing," he said quietly. "I have simply learned to live with what is, and not what could have been." "Perhaps," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight, "but sometimes life has a way of reminding us that what could be is worth noticing." Even after many years, her words lingered in the night air, planting a seed of possibility in Tom's heart. He had spent 20 years without human companionship, and yet here was someone who had arrived without warning, without demand, and without judgment. She had stepped into his world quietly, respectfully, and in doing so had begun to reshape it in ways he had not imagined possible. The following days continued in this pattern of subtle connection. Naeli helped when she could, shared stories when she felt it, and allowed Tom to continue his life without interference. She never forced conversation, never imposed herself on his routines, and yet her presence was felt in every corner of his world. Slowly, Tom began to understand that this woman was unlike anyone he had met, someone who could walk alongside him in the quiet rhythm of his life without disturbing it, and in doing so make it feel fuller, warmer, and more alive. By the end of the week, Tom realized that the plains, which had once felt vast and empty, now carried a different energy. Her presence brought a sense of anticipation and hope, a quiet excitement that he had not felt in decades. He found himself looking forward to her arrival each day, to the conversations, the small tasks, and even the comfortable silences they shared. For the first time in 20 years, he began to imagine the possibility of companionship, not loud or demanding, but steady, patient, and real. And so the days continued, with the sun rising and setting over the endless plains, the wind carrying the scent of the earth, and the quiet rhythm of life persisting. Tom Walker, the cowboy who had spent 20 years alone, had found someone who had arrived unexpectedly, quietly, and completely, reshaping the landscape of his heart in ways he had never anticipated. Naeli, the Apache woman, had entered his world, and though neither of them could have predicted what lay ahead, the seed of connection had been planted, promising change, warmth, and the gentle possibility of a life shared. The days on Tom Walker's land had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface. Naeli's presence was no longer a mere novelty. It had become a part of his daily life. He found himself noticing small things, the way she tied her hair before working, how she listened to the wind, or the careful way she walked near the creek so as not to disturb the wildlife. These observations, which once would have been meaningless to him, now carried weight. He realized that he had begun to care, not in a hurried, desperate way, but in a slow, steady, and careful way. Yet, for all the warmth her presence brought, Tom felt a stirring of unease. After 20 years of solitude, he had built walls around his heart, invisible but strong, designed to protect him from disappointment and pain. Opening up to someone again, even gently, was frightening. Naeli's calm strength and quiet understanding only highlighted the vulnerability he had spent decades trying to bury. He knew she did not demand anything from him, yet the thought of allowing himself to care fully and risk the possibility of loss made him uneasy. One morning, while checking the fences near the northern edge of his property, Tom noticed Naeli observing him from a distance, her eyes thoughtful, her expression unreadable. He approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, and she greeted him with a simple nod. "Tom," she said softly, "there is something I want to ask you. Something important." Tom paused, unsure how to respond. Her tone carried a weight he had not heard before, a mix of seriousness and quiet determination. He nodded silently, inviting her to continue. "You have spent many years alone," Naeli began. "I can see the strength it has given you, and I can see the caution it has instilled. But I also see that your heart is ready for something more, even if you are afraid to admit it." Tom swallowed, feeling the truth of her words deep in his chest. He had always known that he had built walls, that he had learned to protect himself from hurt, but hearing someone else speak it aloud made it impossible to ignore. I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice low. "I've lived this way for 20 years. I've learned to depend on no one but myself." To let someone in, it's not easy. Nayeli took a step closer, her eyes meeting his steadily. "I understand," she said. "I do not ask you to change overnight. I do not ask you to abandon your life. But I do ask that you consider this. Life is fleeting, and the heart is resilient. It can grow, even after years of solitude, if you allow it." Her words struck him like a gentle hand against a long-forgotten wound. He felt a mix of fear and hope, a tug-of-war between the desire to remain safe and the longing to experience something more. He knew she was right, but the fear of vulnerability ran deep. Over the next few days, Nayeli began to push gently against his boundaries, not in a forceful way, but in subtle, meaningful gestures. She would offer to help with chores, not because he needed it, but because she wanted to be part of his world. She would share stories of her travels, her people, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Sometimes she would remain silent, sitting beside him as he worked, allowing him to feel her presence without words. Tom noticed how the animals responded to her. Blue, his loyal horse, seemed calmer, more attentive when she was near. Even the cattle, which had always been wary of strangers, moved with ease when she was around. It was as if her presence harmonized with the land itself, and Tom began to realize that this harmony was something he had been missing in his solitary life. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the plains, Nayeli approached him with a calm but deliberate expression. "You have learned to live alone," she said.
Aww.
"You have grown strong in your solitude, but strength is not only in independence. It is also in knowing when to trust, when to share, and when to allow yourself to feel." Tom listened, feeling the weight of her words. He had always thought of strength as a shield, something that protected him from pain. But Nayeli's words suggested that true strength might also lie in vulnerability, in the courage to let someone into the parts of life he had long kept locked away.
"I don't know if I can," he said quietly, his hands gripping the fence post.
20 years of living this way, it's not easy to change. "You don't have to change overnight," she replied. "I am not asking for that. I am asking you to notice what is possible, to take the first step, even if it feels uncertain. You know deep down what your heart wants. You just have to allow yourself to listen." Her words resonated with him. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a possibility he had almost forgotten existed. He realized that the walls he had built around his heart were not unbreakable. They were simply long-standing habits, born from fear and experience. And now, here was someone who asked not to tear them down, but to open the door just a little. The next day, as they worked together to repair a section of fencing damaged by a recent storm, Nayeli said something that made him pause. "Sometimes," she said, her voice steady, "you have to trust what you already know. You know yourself, you know this land, and you know your heart. And sometimes you know what to do." Tom stopped mid-swing, the hammer heavy in his hands, and looked at her. Her eyes held a quiet certainty, a confidence in him that he had not felt for himself in years. The simplicity of her words struck him more deeply than any grand speech could have. He realized that she was not giving him instructions or demanding action. She was reminding him that he already held the answers within himself. That night, as the stars appeared one by one in the vast desert sky, Tom found himself reflecting on her words. He had spent 20 years without a woman, without companionship beyond the occasional passing traveler or friendly neighbor. He had grown accustomed to his routines, his solitude, and the predictable rhythm of life. And yet, here was someone who had stepped into his world quietly, respectfully, and completely, challenging him, not with force, but with insight. He thought about the moments they had shared, repairing fences, tending to the animals, sitting by the fire in comfortable silence. Each moment had been small, almost ordinary, and yet together they had begun to shape something extraordinary, a sense of connection, trust, and possibility he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. The following days were filled with subtle tests, small challenges that Nayeli presented not through words, but through her presence and actions. She would suggest tasks that required cooperation, moments that required patience, and situations that demanded honesty. Each time, Tom felt the tension in his chest, the fear of failure, and the tug of uncertainty. And each time, he surprised himself by meeting the challenge, realizing that he was capable of more than he had believed. Through these gentle tests, Tom began to understand something important. Strength was not in isolation, nor was it in avoiding vulnerability. Strength was in engaging with life fully, in taking the risks that mattered, and in trusting not only others, but oneself. Nayeli had shown him that the heart, even after years of solitude, could learn to open again, and that doing so was not weakness, but courage. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of indigo and the first stars appeared, Nayeli sat beside him on a fallen log. She looked out over the plains, the quiet wind brushing against her face, and then turned to him. "You know what to do, cowboy," she said softly. Tom felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. They were not a command, but a reminder. He had spent 20 years building walls, avoiding disappointment, and living in solitude. And now, for the first time, he realized that he could choose differently. He could take a step forward, not blindly, but with awareness, with courage, and with hope. He nodded slowly, a small, deliberate motion, feeling a mix of fear, anticipation, and excitement. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in 2 decades, he felt ready to embrace it. Nayeli had not forced him, persuaded him, or rushed him. She had simply shown him that the door was open, and that he had the power to walk through it himself. And so, as the night deepened and the stars shimmered above the plains, Tom Walker, the cowboy who had spent 20 years alone, felt the stirrings of change. Nayeli, the Apache woman who had entered his life quietly but fully, had presented him with a choice to trust, to feel, and to take the first steps toward a life that could be richer, fuller, and more alive than he had ever imagined. For the first time in 20 years, he realized that solitude had been a teacher, but companionship could be a new kind of strength. And in that quiet, starlit moment, he understood that the challenge she had given him was not one of words, but of heart, and that he was ready to meet it. The days that followed Nayeli's words, "You know what to do, cowboy," were unlike any Tom Walker had experienced in 20 years. Each morning he awoke with a quiet sense of anticipation, the weight of solitude replaced by the subtle excitement of possibility. The plains, which had once felt empty and endless, now seemed alive with potential. Even the wind seemed to carry a different song, one that whispered of trust, connection, and the courage to step forward. Tom tried to continue his routines as before, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and riding Blue across the rolling hills. But everything felt different. Tasks that had once been solitary now seemed richer when Nayeli joined him, offering her quiet guidance, her steady presence, and a patience he had never known. She never demanded attention, never imposed herself, but simply existed beside him in a way that made the work lighter, the day brighter, and the horizon more welcoming. It was not just the physical work that began to change. Tom found himself sharing stories of his past with her, memories he had long buried in the quiet recesses of his mind. He told her about the first time he rode a horse alone across the plains, the storms that had terrified him, and the fleeting relationships that had ended in heartbreak. Each story was a brick removed from the walls he had built around his heart, each memory a step toward vulnerability he had avoided for decades. Nayeli listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting understanding and patience. Sometimes she would ask questions, not to pry, but to help him reflect, to help him see the lessons he had learned and the strength he had gained. "You have lived with courage all these years," she said one evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple. "Not many could survive as you have, and not many could remain true to themselves. That is strength, Tom. But strength alone is not enough. The heart needs more. It needs connection." Her words resonated deeply within him. For 20 years, he had believed that survival was enough. He had focused on self-reliance, hard work, and endurance, never allowing himself to imagine that life could be richer than mere survival. Yet Nayeli's presence challenged that belief, showing him that strength could coexist with openness, courage with vulnerability, and solitude with companionship. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains. Dark clouds gathered and the wind began to whip through the tall grasses. Tom and Nayeli were out checking the northern fences, and the first drops of rain fell, cool and insistent. They hurried back toward the cabin, the storm growing stronger with every step. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the plains in brief, brilliant bursts. Tom realized in that moment that the storm was more than just weather. It was a test. He had spent 2 decades avoiding the unpredictability of human emotion, and now, standing beside Nayeli, he felt the fear of letting himself be vulnerable. The wind tugged at his coat, the rain soaked his hair and clothes, and yet he noticed something extraordinary. He was not afraid in the same way he once would have been. Nayeli's presence made him feel grounded, even as the storm raged around them. When they reached the cabin, Nayeli smiled at him, water dripping from her hair. "Do not be afraid of the storm, Tom," she said softly. "It passes. And sometimes the storm reminds us that we are alive, that we can endure, and that we can find shelter together." Her words were simple, yet profound. Tom felt a lump rise in his throat, a mixture of fear, relief, and something new, hope. He realized that the storm mirrored his emotions, turbulent, unpredictable, and intense, yet capable of clearing the air and revealing clarity afterward. He had spent 20 years avoiding storms of the heart, and now he understood that they were not to be feared, but embraced. As the storm raged outside, they sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames contrasting with the chill of the rain. Tom watched Nayeli as she worked quietly, tending to the small tasks inside the cabin, and he felt a growing awareness of how deeply he had begun to care for her. He had avoided emotional intimacy for so long, yet now, in the quiet of the storm, he realized that his heart was ready to open. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened. They shared laughter, worked together, and found comfort in each other's presence. Yet there was always a subtle challenge, a tension that demanded honesty, courage, and trust. Nayeli never forced him to confront his feelings directly, but her actions and words encouraged him to examine the walls he had built and the fears he had carried for 2 decades. One evening, as the sky turned deep blue and the stars began to shimmer above the plains, Nayeli approached him while he tended to a small fire outside the cabin. She looked at him steadily, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Tom," she said softly, "you have lived with caution, with care, and with restraint. You have protected yourself for many years, but now it is time to choose. You know what your heart wants. You know what is right, and you know what to do." Her words were not a demand. They were a gentle push, a challenge, and a reminder that he had the power to decide for himself. Tom felt the weight of her gaze, the sincerity of her voice. and the undeniable truth in her words. For 20 years he had avoided vulnerability, but now he realized that life had placed someone in his path who could walk beside him, not over him, and who offered the possibility of connection without pressure or judgment. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. He realized that the choice was his alone, that his fear of loss had kept him from experiencing life fully, and that he had the strength to move forward. Nayeli's patience, understanding, and quiet challenge had shown him that vulnerability was not weakness, but a kind of bravery he had long overlooked. In the days that followed, Tom began to act on this realization. He allowed himself to share more, his thoughts, his memories, and his small dreams for the future. He learned to listen more deeply, not just to Nayeli, but to himself and the land around him. Each small step of trust, each act of openness, was a victory against the years of isolation that had shaped him. One afternoon, while riding across the plains, Tom realized something remarkable. He had spent 20 years without a woman, convinced that solitude was the safest path. Yet now, with Nayeli by his side, he saw that companionship could be a source of strength, joy, and growth. He understood that the challenges he had faced in his life, loneliness, hardship, and fear, had prepared him to recognize and embrace something rare and valuable. Nayeli was not just a visitor. She was a presence that complemented his life, enriching it in ways he had never imagined. The emotional climax of their growing bond came on a quiet evening when the sky was painted with the soft glow of sunset. They sat together on a fallen log, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. Nayeli's hand brushed lightly against his, a simple gesture, yet one that carried the weight of trust, encouragement, and connection. Tom felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, joy, and love, that he had long believed impossible after 20 years of solitude. "I never thought I could feel this way again," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought my heart was closed, that I had lost the ability to care like this." Nayeli smiled, her eyes gentle and knowing. "Your heart was never lost," she said softly. "It was waiting. Waiting for the right moment, and for someone who could walk beside you without rushing, without demanding, and without fear. You have lived 20 years alone, and now you are ready to embrace what is possible." Tom felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and love. The emotional walls he had built over 2 decades began to crumble, brick by brick, replaced by a newfound openness, trust, and willingness to embrace life fully. He realized that the journey of solitude had led him here, not as an end, but as preparation for something extraordinary. As night fell over the plains, Tom and Nayeli sat together in quiet contentment, the stars above reflecting the vast possibilities of life. The emotional peak of their journey had been reached, not in grand declarations or dramatic events, but in the quiet realization that connection, trust, and love were worth the risk. For the first time in 20 years, Tom felt whole, not because his solitude had ended, but because he had allowed someone to walk beside him, offering understanding, patience, and the gentle challenge to open his heart. And so the plains that had once felt empty and endless now seemed full of promise. Tom Walker, a cowboy who had spent 2 decades without a woman, had discovered that strength, courage, and resilience were not only about surviving alone. They were about the bravery to trust, to feel, and to embrace the unexpected gift of companionship. Nayeli had shown him that the heart could grow, even after years of solitude, and that life's most meaningful moments often arrived quietly, patiently, and without warning. The mornings on Tom Walker's land had begun to feel different. The sun rose over the plains with the same quiet majesty as always, but now its warmth seemed to carry a sense of hope. Tom had spent 20 years in solitude, living only for survival and routine. Yet the arrival of Nayeli had shifted something fundamental within him. Life no longer felt like a long stretch of empty days. It had become richer, filled with the possibility of shared experiences, laughter, and companionship. Tom's days continued with the familiar work of a cowboy, checking the cattle, mending fences, and riding across the open land, but the rhythm of his life had changed. He now carried the gentle awareness of Nayeli's presence, and that awareness transformed everything. Even the simplest tasks, like tending the animals or preparing meals, felt more meaningful when shared. He noticed the small details he had once taken for granted. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees near the creek, the sound of Blue's hooves in the soft earth, and the laughter that now occasionally echoed from the cabin. Nayeli had settled comfortably into his world, not as a guest or an intruder, but as a companion who understood the unspoken rhythms of his life. She moved with quiet confidence, helping when needed, observing when necessary, and always respecting the balance he had built over 2 decades. Yet she also challenged him in ways that were gentle but firm, encouraging him to open his heart, to trust, and to embrace life fully. One morning, Tom woke to the sound of birds singing and the soft rustle of the wind. Nayeli was already up, tending to a small fire and preparing a simple breakfast. He watched her quietly for a moment, noticing the way she moved, the calm expression on her face, and the quiet strength she carried. He realized how much he had come to depend on her presence, not because he could not manage alone, but because life had become richer, fuller, and warmer with her in it. "Good morning," he said softly, approaching the fire. "Good morning," she replied, her voice carrying the gentle melody of familiarity. "Sleep well?" "Yes," he admitted, taking a deep breath. "Better than I have in years." Her smile was small but knowing, and Tom felt a warmth spread through him. For the first time in 2 decades, he understood that companionship did not diminish independence. Rather, it enhanced it. Life could be shared without fear of losing oneself, and he could feel deeply without losing the strength he had cultivated in solitude. The day unfolded with quiet productivity. They tended to the cattle together, patched fences that had been weakened by recent storms, and collected firewood near the edge of the creek. There was a comfortable rhythm to their work, a balance of effort and observation, silence and conversation. Tom found himself laughing more than he had in years, enjoying the small moments that had once passed unnoticed. In the afternoon, as they rested beneath the shade of a large oak tree, Nayeli turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You have grown strong in your solitude," she said, "and yet you have learned that strength can be shared." "That is rare, Tom. Many people never realize that the heart can expand, even after long years of isolation." Tom nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words. "I never believed I could feel like this again," he admitted. 20 years alone, I thought my heart had closed.
I thought I had lost the ability to trust, to care, to share my life."
"You never lost it," she said gently. "It was waiting. Waiting for someone who could enter your world with patience, respect, and understanding. And now you see that life can be different, that love and trust are not things to fear, but things to embrace." Her words resonated deeply, and Tom realized how much he had grown, not only in his willingness to open his heart, but in his understanding of what it meant to truly live. Life was no longer simply about survival or routine. It was about connection, joy, and the courage to face uncertainty with someone by his side. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Tom and Nayeli returned to the cabin. The fire was lit, casting a warm glow across the room, and the smell of simple food filled the air. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that spoke of trust, understanding, and mutual respect. After the meal, Tom stepped outside to watch the sunset. The plains stretched endlessly before him, a vast expanse of grass, hills, and sky. For 20 years he had walked these lands alone, finding beauty in the solitude, but also feeling the weight of emptiness. Now, with Nayeli beside him, the plains seemed fuller, more alive, and filled with possibilities he had never imagined. Nayeli joined him, standing quietly at his side. They watched as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows and painting the world in soft, warm colors. Tom realized that the emotional journey he had taken over the past weeks had reached a turning point. He had faced his fears, allowed himself to feel, and embraced the challenge Nayeli had presented. The walls around his heart had been lifted, replaced with a willingness to trust and to love. "Do you remember what you told me?" Tom asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Nayeli nodded, her expression calm.
"I said you knew what to do, and I do," he said, a small smile forming on his lips. "I have always known."
"I just needed someone to remind me." Her smile deepened, and for the first time, Tom felt completely at peace. He realized that the journey of solitude had been necessary, that the years of independence and hard work had prepared him to truly appreciate this moment. Nayeli had not forced him, persuaded him, or rushed him. She had simply shown him the possibility of a life shared, and he had chosen to embrace it. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet joy and a deepening sense of connection. They continued to work together, share meals, and explore the plains, discovering new trails, hidden groves, and peaceful spots by the creek. Tom found himself noticing things he had never seen before: the way the light reflected on the water, the songs of birds at dawn, and the subtle changes in the wind that hinted at approaching weather. Life, once predictable and steady, now held small surprises and delights at every turn. Evenings were spent by the fire, sharing stories of the past and dreams for the future. Tom spoke of the hardships he had faced, the loneliness he had endured, and the lessons he had learned from years of living alone. Nayeli shared tales of her family, her travels, and the wisdom she had gained from her people. Each story, each shared memory, strengthened the bond between them, creating a foundation of trust, respect, and understanding that was both rare and precious. One night, as the stars shimmered overhead and the plains were bathed in silver moonlight, Tom realized something profound. He had spent 20 years without a woman, believing that he had chosen solitude out of necessity. Yet now, he understood that the years of isolation had not been a punishment, but preparation. They had taught him patience, resilience, and the importance of self-reliance. And in that preparation, he was ready to embrace a new chapter, one filled with companionship, love, and shared experiences. Nayeli, sensing his reflection, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have grown much, Tom," she said softly, "not just in strength, but in understanding. You see now that life can be shared, that the heart can open even after years of solitude, and that trust is a gift, not a risk." Tom nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I am ready. I am ready to live fully, to share this life, and to embrace the future with you." Her smile was radiant, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. And in that moment, Tom knew that the plains, which had once symbolized isolation and distance, now represented freedom, connection, and the promise of a life shared. The days turned into months, and their bond grew stronger. Tom and Nayeli worked side by side, rode together across the hills, and explored the beauty of the plains with a sense of wonder that neither had expected. The land, which had once been a backdrop for solitude, became a canvas for their shared life, a place where love, trust, and companionship could flourish. Tom often thought back to the moment Nayeli had first arrived, walking along the dusty trail to his cabin. He remembered the quiet strength she had carried, the patient understanding she had offered, and the gentle challenge she had presented. 20 years without a woman had shaped him into someone cautious, resilient, and self-reliant. And yet her arrival had opened a door he had long believed closed. In the quiet moments of reflection, he realized that the gift of companionship was not just about love. It was about partnership, respect, and mutual growth. Nayeli had shown him that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when shared with someone who understood, supported, and challenged him in equal measure. As the sun set over the plains, casting a warm glow across the land, Tom and Nayeli stood together, hand in hand, feeling the weight of the past lift and the promise of the future fill their hearts. 20 years of solitude had ended, not with haste or force, but with patience, understanding, and the quiet arrival of someone who knew how to bring out the best in him. Tom Walker, the cowboy who had spent 2 decades alone, had discovered that life's greatest joys often arrive quietly, patiently, and unexpectedly. The plains, once a symbol of isolation, now reflected the beauty of connection, the strength of trust, and the simple, profound happiness of a life shared. And with Nayeli by his side, he knew that the journey ahead, whatever it held, would be filled with love, understanding, and the courage to embrace every moment fully.